The front door was a liar. It looked solid, dependable, a handsome slab of oak with a stained glass window that threw fractured rainbows across the hall floor on sunny afternoons. But for the past 6 months, it had developed a personality flaw. It stuck, not a gentle catch, but a deep, shuddering groan of wood against frame, a protest that required a hip check and a muttered curse to overcome. It was a physical manifestation of my life, seemingly fine on the surface, but fundamentally stuck. For weeks, I told myself I'd fix it. I'd watched online tutorials, bought a hand planer I didn't know how to use, and even gave the jam a few pathetic whacks with a rubber mallet. The door just laughed at me, its woody side growing more contemptuous with each failed attempt. My life was a series of these small, accumulating failures, these things I intended to fix, but never quite managed. The dripping tap in the guest bathroom. The novel I'd started 3 years ago, its file buried under layers of freelance graphic design work. The persistent, low-grade loneliness that had become as much a part of the house's atmosphere as the scent of dust and old books. Finally, I'd surrendered. My neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose garden was as immaculate as her gossip was rampant, had recommended a handyman. Grant, she'd said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper over the fence. A widower. Very capable. Fixed my gutter in an hour and didn't trample a single petunia. The word widower hung in the air, a piece of information delivered with the weight of a character reference. It implied a certain gravity, a seriousness that a younger, flakier contractor might lack. It also, for a reason I refused to examine too closely, made my stomach clench. I called him. His voice on the phone was exactly as I'd imagined, a low, calm baritone, the kind of voice that could talk you through defusing a bomb or assembling a flat-pack bookshelf with equal authority. He said he could come by Thursday. Thursday arrived, gray and damp. I spent the morning in a state of low-level anxiety, cleaning surfaces that were already clean and changing my shirt 3 times. It was ridiculous. He was a handyman, not a date. But the prospect of a stranger entering my space, this quiet sanctuary I'd curated since my last relationship imploded 5 years ago, felt like an invasion. My ex, Mark, had hated this house, called it a dusty mausoleum. In a way, he was right. I'd inherited it from my grandparents and had changed almost nothing. It was a house preserved in amber, and I was the fossil trapped inside. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doorbell chimed, a sound so rare it made me jump. I peered through the peephole, the warped glass distorting the figure on my porch into a wavy, broad-shouldered giant. I took a breath, turned the deadbolt, and prepared for the requisite hip check to open the door. But before I could, there was a soft knock, and the door swung inward smoothly, silently, without a hint of its usual complaint. Standing on the welcome mat was a man who was not a giant, but was built with a quiet solidity that seemed to take up more space than he physically occupied. He was holding my door open with one hand, a large, red toolbox in the other. He looked to be in his early 40s, with short, dark hair salted with gray at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same oak as my troublesome door. He wasn't smiling, but the corners of his eyes, etched with fine lines, held a hint of amusement. His gaze was direct, a steady, assessing blue that seemed to take in everything at once. Me, the hallway, the silent protest my door had just failed to make. "Grant," he said. His voice was even deeper in person, a low rumble that vibrated in the narrow hallway. "Leo," I managed, my own voice sounding thin and reedy in comparison. It opened. He finally did smile, just a slight upturn of one corner of his mouth. It changed his entire face, softening the hard lines and making him look less intimidating and more weary. Like he'd seen a lot of things and wasn't easily surprised. "Sometimes they just need to be shown who's boss," he said. He gestured with his chin towards the hinge side of the door. "Looks like your top hinge is sagging. Common in old houses. They settle." He said the word settle with a finality that seemed to apply to more than just architecture. I just stood there, mute, my carefully rehearsed explanation of the door's specific sticking points dissolving on my tongue. He stepped inside, and the air shifted. He brought the outside with him, the clean, cold scent of a damp autumn morning, mixed with something else. Something warm and masculine. Sawdust, maybe, and a faint, pleasant hint of coffee. He set his toolbox down on the runner with a heavy, satisfying thud. The sound was alien in my quiet house. It was a sound of purpose, of action, a sound of things about to be fixed. He crouched down, running a large, calloused hand along the bottom edge of the door, his fingers tracing the wood with a familiarity that was almost intimate. I watched his hand, the blunt, clean nails, the dusting of dark hair on his knuckles. It was a hand that knew how to work. My own hands, pale and soft from years spent on a keyboard and drawing tablet, felt suddenly useless. Mind if I? He looked up at me, his blue eyes catching the light from the stained glass window. The fractured rainbows danced across his cheekbone. Oh, no, go ahead, I said, stepping back, feeling like an intruder in my own hallway. For the next hour, I became an observer. I retreated to the living room, ostensibly to work on a logo design for a new artisanal pickle company, but my focus was shot. My ears were tuned to the sounds coming from the hall. The rhythmic scrape of a plane against wood, the decisive tap of a hammer, the low, occasional curse when a screw refused to turn. Each sound was a testament to a competence I utterly lacked. I found myself watching him from the corner of my eye. He moved with an unhurried economy, no wasted motion. He was completely absorbed in his task, his brow furrowed in concentration. The sleeves of his gray Henley were pushed up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms dusted with the same dark hair as his hands. A faint sheen of sweat glistened on his temples. I felt a strange, unfamiliar pang in my chest. It wasn't just attraction, though that was certainly part of it. It was a kind of awe. He was a man who could fix things. I was a man who let things break. He worked through lunch. Around 1, the rhythmic scraping stopped. I heard him packing his tools away, the metallic clink of steel on steel. I felt a surge of panic. He was leaving. The thought was absurdly disappointing. I'd gotten used to his presence, the quiet industry in the hall. It had made the house feel less empty. I walked out to the hallway, my heart thumping a stupid, frantic rhythm against my ribs. He was standing up, wiping his hands on a rag he'd pulled from his back pocket. The door stood ajar, looking somehow prouder, straighter. All done, he said, his voice still low and even. Shouldn't give you any more trouble. I shimmed the top hinge and planed a 1/16 of an inch off the bottom. It was swelling with the damp. Thank you, I said, the words feeling inadequate. I really appreciate it. He nodded, his gaze sweeping over the door frame, his expression that of a painter assessing his canvas. Good bones in this house, he commented, more to himself than to me. Just needs a bit of attention. His eyes met mine, and for a split second, I felt like he wasn't talking about the house at all. I felt a blush creep up my neck. I was being ridiculous. He was a handyman. I was a client. This was a transaction. What do I owe you? I asked, pulling out my wallet, eager to return to the safety of our prescribed roles. He named a price that seemed far too reasonable. As I counted out the cash, my fingers fumbled. I dropped a $20 bill. We both bent to pick it up at the same time. His hand, warm and rough, brushed against mine. A jolt, sharp and startling, shot up my arm. It was nothing. An accident. But my breath hitched, and when I looked up, his face was very close to mine. I could see the tiny flecks of gold in his blue eyes. I could smell the coffee on his breath. The air grew thick, charged with a sudden, unspoken tension. He held my gaze for a beat too long, his expression unreadable. Then he straightened up, taking the bill from my numb fingers. Keep the change, I mumbled, thrusting the rest of the cash at him. He took it, his fingers brushing mine again, this time with what felt like a deliberate slowness. Thanks, he said. He picked up his toolbox, the moment broken. But as he turned to leave, he paused at the now perfectly aligned door. He pushed it shut. It closed with a soft, satisfying click. No groan, no shudder, no protest. He opened it again, swung it back and forth a few times, testing the hinge. He was just doing his job, checking his work. But the way he was looking at me felt like he was checking something else entirely. Seems to work, he said, his voice a low murmur. He let the door swing shut until it was almost closed, leaving just a crack of light between us. His face was in shadow. A good door should close smoothly. No resistance, he paused, and his eyes found mine in the dim light. You, on the other hand. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The air crackled. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This is it. This is the moment where I can retreat back into my safe, lonely world. I can make a joke, thank him again, and close the door on this strange, unsettling feeling. Or I can stay right here, in this charged silence, and see what happens next. He was giving me a choice. The silence stretched, thin and taut. I could hear the clock ticking in the living room, a sound I normally never noticed. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. He watched me, his face impassive, but his eyes were asking a question. And I knew, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, that I didn't want him to leave. I wanted to know what it felt like not to be stuck. I did nothing. I said nothing. I just stood there, my inaction a form of consent. A slow smile, the first real one I'd seen, spread across his face. It was a devastatingly handsome smile. He pushed the door open again, stepped back into my hallway, and closed it behind him. The soft click echoed in the silence. We were alone. Just us. The house felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. He set his toolbox down again, the sound now promising something entirely different. He took a step towards me, and then another. He moved with that same deliberate, unhurried grace he'd used with his tools. He was fixing something else now. Or maybe he was breaking it. I wasn't sure which. I wasn't sure I cared. The days that followed were a study in tension and observation. Grant didn't leave after that first, charged moment in the hallway. The kiss that I had been so certain was coming never materialized. Instead, he had looked at me, that devastating smile softening into something more thoughtful, and pointed to a watermark on the ceiling. "You've got a leaky flashing around your chimney," he'd said, his voice perfectly level, as if the last 5 minutes of unbearable subtext had never happened. "If you want, I can take a look tomorrow." And just like that, the bubble of tension popped, leaving me breathless and confused. I'd agreed, of course. My brain, still reeling, could only form a single, compliant word. Okay. He had left then, with a simple nod and a quiet, "See you tomorrow, Leo." I had spent the rest of the day replaying our entire interaction, analyzing every glance, every pause, every brushed knuckle. I was an expert in overthinking, and Grant had just given me a masterpiece to work with. He came back the next day, and the day after that. The leaky flashing led to him noticing the drafty window in my studio, which led to him pointing out the loose floorboard on the landing. My house, my supposed sanctuary, turned out to be a litany of small disintegrations. And Grant became a fixture in it. His red toolbox by the door became a familiar sight. The scent of sawdust and coffee began to permeate the air, overriding the usual smell of old paper and solitude. He was a quiet presence, methodical and focused. He'd arrive at 9, work steadily until 5, and leave with that same quiet nod. We fell into a strange, domestic rhythm. I'd make a pot of coffee in the morning, and he'd accept a mug with a low murmur of thanks. At lunchtime, I'd make sandwiches, and we'd eat them in the kitchen, mostly in silence. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a companionable quiet, filled with the sounds of chewing and the hum of the refrigerator. I watched him constantly. I learned the map of his body, the way the muscles in his back shifted as he lifted a heavy sheet of drywall, the way he'd bite his lower lip when concentrating on a difficult measurement. I learned the cadence of his breathing, the soft sigh he'd let out when he finished a task to his satisfaction. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He was patient, meticulous. He treated the wounds of my old house with a reverence that bordered on tenderness. He patched plaster, sanded wood, and replaced worn-out fixtures with a steady, capable hand. He was, quite literally, putting my house back together. And in doing so, he was slowly, methodically, dismantling the walls I had built around myself. Our conversations were brief, utilitarian. He'd ask me about the house, its history. I told him about my grandparents, how they'd built it after the war. He listened intently, his blue eyes fixed on my face, making me feel as though I were saying something profound. In return, he offered up small, curated pieces of his own life. He mentioned his late wife, Sarah, just once. We were in the garden, where he was fixing a wobbly fence post. Sarah loved hydrangeas, he'd said, looking at the overgrown bush by the porch. Said they were honest flowers. Never pretended to be something they weren't. He said it without sadness, just a simple statement of fact. But it was a window into his past, a glimpse of the man he was before he was the quiet widower who fixed things. It was a moment of unexpected softness, and it made my chest ache. The physical contact between us was minimal, accidental, but each instance was a seismic event in my quiet world. He'd hand me a tool, and his fingers would linger against mine for a fraction of a second too long. He'd brush past me in the narrow upstairs hallway, and his arm would press against my back, a solid, warm weight that left my skin tingling long after he'd passed. I'd analyze these moments for hours, turning them over and over in my mind like a smooth, worrying stone. Was it intentional? Was he testing me, pushing the boundaries of our professional relationship? Or was I just a lonely, touch-starved man projecting his own desires onto an oblivious stranger? I suspected it was the latter, but a small, hopeful part of me clung to the possibility that it was the former. One afternoon, he was working on the sash window in my studio. It was a delicate operation, requiring him to remove the old, brittle putty without breaking the original, wavy glass. I was at my desk, pretending to work, but really I was just watching the late afternoon sun illuminate the dust motes dancing around his head. He was so focused, his movements so precise. He let out a frustrated sigh. "Damn it," he muttered. "I need another pair of hands for a second. Can you hold this sash steady?" I was out of my chair in an instant. Of course. I stood beside him, my shoulder brushing his. He smelled of wood glue and that clean, masculine scent that was uniquely his. I placed my hands on the wooden frame where he indicated. My hands were inches from his. I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "Just hold it right there," he instructed, his voice low and close to my ear. "Don't let it slip." I held my breath, focusing all my energy on keeping the window sash perfectly still. He worked with a small, sharp tool, carefully scraping away the last of the old putty. His knuckles brushed against my thumb. A spark. I flinched, and the sash wobbled. "Easy," he said, his voice a calming rumble. He didn't move away. Instead, he placed his free hand over mine, his large, warm palm completely covering my fingers, pressing them firmly against the wood. Just like that. Steady, my heart was a trip hammer in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could feel was the weight of his hand, the rough texture of his calluses against my skin, the gentle, unyielding pressure. It wasn't a sexual touch, not explicitly. It was instructional, practical, but it was also the most intimate physical contact I'd had in 5 years. He held his hand there, over mine, for what felt like an eternity as he finished his work. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint scrape of his tool and the frantic thumping of my own blood in my ears. When he was done, he removed his hand slowly, his fingers dragging across mine. "There," he said, stepping back to admire his work. "Good as new." I couldn't speak. I just stared at my hand, which still tingled from the memory of his touch. I felt exposed, my yearning laid bare. I risked a glance at him. He was watching me, his expression unreadable, that familiar, assessing look in his blue eyes. He knew. Of course, he knew. He was a man who noticed every flaw, every stress fracture, every loose board. He had to have noticed the way I watched him, the way I flinched at his touch, the way my breath caught in my throat whenever he was near. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. He knew, and he was still here. He hadn't run. He hadn't put up a professional wall. He had just covered my hand with his and told me to be steady. The tipping point came on a Friday. Grant had finished all the major repairs. The house was no longer a collection of looming projects. The door closed silently, the windows didn't rattle, the floors didn't creak. My sanctuary was sound, secure, and Grant had no reason to come back. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The thought of this house returning to its previous silence, of not hearing the thud of his toolbox in the morning, was unbearable. He was packing up his tools for the last time. The metallic clicks and clinks sounded like a death knell. I stood in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame, watching him. I needed to say something, do something, to stop this from ending. But the words wouldn't come. He finished packing, wiped his hands on his customary rag, and turned to face me. "Well," he said, and the single word was heavy with finality. "That's everything." "Thank you," I said, my voice hoarse. "For everything. The house, it feels different." "It's a good house," he replied, his gaze sweeping around the hall, the living room, the stairs. "Just needed someone to pay attention to it." He looked at me, and his eyes were serious. "Everything needs a little attention now and then, Leo." My heart is pounding. This is it. The end of the transaction. He's going to hand me a final invoice. I'm going to pay him, and he's going to walk out that perfectly hung door and out of my life. The thought is a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I can't let that happen. He picks up his toolbox. I can't move. I'm frozen in the doorway, a silent sentinel guarding a life I suddenly don't want anymore. He walks towards me, towards the door. He stops in front of me, so close I can see the silver flecks in his 5 o'clock shadow. He doesn't try to move past me. He just waits. The silence is a living thing, pulsing between us. You're in my way, he says, but his voice is soft, and there's no hint of impatience in it. I know, I whisper. He searches my face, his blue eyes intense, probing. He's looking for something, an answer to a question he hasn't asked out loud. He wets his lips, and my eyes are drawn to the movement. I feel a pull, a magnetic force drawing me forward. This is insane. I'm a 32-year-old man who hasn't been on a date in 5 years, and I'm about to throw myself at the handyman. My brain is screaming at me to step aside, to let him leave, to retreat to the safety of my newly repaired shell. But my body, my heart, they refuse to listen. The front door hinge. I blurt out, the words nonsensical, desperate. You tested it. A slow smile plays on his lips. That devastating smile. I did, he confirms. It passed. And then, I swallow hard, my throat suddenly dry. You said I had resistance. His smile widens. He sets the toolbox down. The thud is a period at the end of a sentence. A chapter ending, a new one beginning. I did say that, he says, his voice a low purr. I was wondering if you were ever going to bring it up. He takes a step closer, closing the small gap between us. He raises a hand, not to touch me, but to brace himself on the doorframe, right next to my head. He's caging me in, and I have never felt more free. So, the question is, he murmurs, his face so close I can feel the warmth of his breath on my skin. Do you still have resistance, Leo? I am breaking. All the carefully constructed walls, the years of self-imposed isolation, the fear and the loneliness, it's all crumbling to dust under the weight of his gaze. I can't speak. I can only shake my head, a small, jerky movement. No, no more resistance. Good, he breathes. And then he leans in and kisses me. It wasn't a tentative kiss. There was no hesitation. It was a kiss of absolute certainty, of pent-up longing finally unleashed. His lips were firm, warm, and tasted faintly of coffee and something uniquely, intoxicatingly him. His hand moved from the doorframe to the back of my neck, his calloused fingers tangling in my hair, holding me steady as he deepened the kiss. My hands, of their own accord, came up to rest on his chest, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt, the steady, strong beat of his heart. It was a kiss that wiped my mind clean of everything but the here and now. The feel of him, the taste of him, the scent of him. It was overwhelming. It was perfect. It was a kiss that fixed everything. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look at me, his forehead resting against mine. His blue eyes were dark with emotion. No resistance at all, he whispered, a note of satisfaction in his voice. And then he kissed me again, slower this time, more deliberate. A kiss of discovery. A kiss that felt like a promise. A kiss that felt like coming home. The world tilted and then settled, finding a new, more stable center of gravity. When the second kiss ended, we just stood there in the hallway, foreheads pressed together, breathing each other's air. The silence that returned was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full, humming with everything that had just happened and everything that was about to. Grant's hand was still tangled in my hair, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin behind my ear. It was a gesture of such casual intimacy, it made my knees weak. My own hands were still flat against his chest, as if I were afraid he might disappear if I let go. So, he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through me. I guess I should send you a final invoice. A laugh, rusty from disuse, bubbled up out of my chest. It was a shaky, breathless sound. Is this on the invoice? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He pulled back enough to look me in the eye, a genuine, heart-stopping smile lighting up his entire face. I'm thinking of it as a bonus, he said. For a particularly challenging job. He let his hand slide from my hair, down my neck, coming to rest on my shoulder, his thumb tracing my collarbone. His touch was grounding, real. This was real. This wasn't some fantasy I'd cooked up in my lonely head. But then, A cold wave of anxiety washed over me. The morning after. What happened now? This was the part one was bad at. The beginning. The fragile, uncertain steps after the first, explosive connection. My history was a highlight reel of disastrous second dates and relationships that fizzled out before they even began. I was good at the yearning, the observation. I was terrible at the reality. My smile must have faltered because the light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a look of concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, his perceptive gaze missing nothing. "Nothing," I lied, pulling away slightly, my hands dropping from his chest. The loss of contact was immediate and sharp. "It's just this is new. New for me too," he said quietly. His honesty was a disarming blow. "Sarah's been gone 6 years. I haven't. I wasn't looking for this." The mention of his wife's name was a stark reminder of the life he'd lived before he walked through my door. A life with love, with partnership. A life I knew nothing about. I felt a pang of something ugly and small. Insecurity. Jealousy of a ghost. I was just a project to him. A broken house that needed fixing. Now that the job was done, what was left? The kiss had been a bonus, a moment of spontaneous combustion. It didn't mean anything more. My old thought patterns, the well-worn grooves of self-doubt, were taking over. He must have seen the storm in my eyes, because he sighed, a soft, weary sound. He didn't say anything. He just reached out, took my hand, and laced his fingers through mine. His grip was firm, resolute. He led me from the hallway into the living room and sat me down on the sofa. He sat beside me, not too close, but not far away either, still holding my hand. He didn't let go. "Leo," he said, his voice gentle but firm, forcing me to look at him. "I'm not a complicated man. I don't play games. For the past 2 weeks, I've been coming to this house, telling myself I was just here to fix a leaky roof and a sticky door. But I was lying to myself." He squeezed my hand. "I enjoyed watching you. The way you get lost in your work. The way you blush when you think I'm not looking. I kept finding more things to fix because I didn't want to stop coming here. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest." He was saying everything I had been too afraid to even hope for. He had been watching me, just as I had been watching him. It wasn't one-sided. It was mutual. "I don't know what this is," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "And I don't know where it's going. But I know that kissing you felt more right than anything has in a very long time. And I know I'm not ready for it to be over." Vulnerability. He was offering me his, laid out plain and simple, a stark contrast to my own tangled mess of insecurities. He was making a conscious choice, and he was inviting me to make one too. The ball was in my court. I could retreat, thank him for his honesty, and let the moment pass. Or I could meet his vulnerability with my own. I took a deep breath. "I don't want it to be over either," I said, the words coming out stronger than I expected. When you were packing your tools, I panicked. The thought of this house being quiet again. I trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of the desolation I had felt. "It doesn't have to be quiet," he said softly. And that was it. A simple statement. A simple choice. We sat there for a long time, hands linked, the late afternoon sun slanting through the windows, illuminating the dust motes still dancing in the air. But they didn't look like symbols of neglect anymore. They looked like tiny, glittering promises. Grant didn't stay the night. We talked for another hour, the conversation shifting from the monumental to the mundane. He told me about his small house on the other side of town, the vegetable garden he was proud of, the stray cat he fed. I told him about my freelance work, my love for old movies, my failed attempt at baking sourdough during the lockdown. It was easy, frighteningly easy. When it was finally dark, he stood up to leave. The anxiety flared in me again, a Pavlovian response to an impending departure. He walked me to the door, my door, our door, and turned to face me. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of intent. "Okay," I said, my voice small. He hesitated for a moment, then leaned in and gave me a soft, chaste kiss on the lips. It was a gentle reassurance, a stark contrast to the passionate embrace in the hallway earlier, but it was no less potent. "Get some rest, Leo," he murmured against my mouth. And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him with its newfound, perfect silence. I woke up the next morning in a state of profound unease. The house was too quiet. The space where Grant's toolbox had been was glaringly empty. I wandered through the rooms, touching the smooth plaster he'd patched, running my hand over the window he'd secured. The evidence of him was everywhere, but he was gone. My mind, my worst enemy, started its insidious work. Had I imagined it all? The intensity, the confession, the promises whispered in the half-light? Maybe it was just a moment of shared loneliness, a fleeting connection that would wither in the harsh light of day. He'd said he would call, but the phone remained silent. Each passing hour was a fresh torment. I jumped every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaping into my throat, only to sink again when it was just a work email or a notification from a news app. By lunchtime, I had convinced myself it was over. He regretted it. He'd woken up this morning and decided that getting involved with a neurotic, emotionally stunted graphic designer was more trouble than it was worth. The thought was a cold, sick weight in my stomach. I couldn't eat. I couldn't work. I just paced the floors of my perfectly repaired house, feeling more broken than ever. Around 2 in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. I froze. It couldn't be. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. It was him, Grant. He was standing on my porch, holding not a toolbox, but a brown paper bag that smelled, even through the door, of fresh bread and something savory. My heart did a painful, hopeful flip. I took a breath and opened the door. He stood there, looking just as solid and real as ever. He also looked a little nervous. His eyes met mine, a question in them. "Hi," he said. "Hi." I replied, my voice weak with relief. He began, lifting the bag slightly. "I forgot a tool yesterday." It was the flimsiest excuse I had ever heard. A beautiful, transparent lie. A smile broke across my face, a real one, full of all the relief and hope that was flooding through me. "Did you?" His own nervous expression melted away, replaced by a soft, answering smile. "No," he admitted. "I just wanted to see you. And I was in the neighborhood, and I passed that bakery you said you liked." He held out the bag. "I brought you lunch. If you're not busy." I was so full of emotion I couldn't speak. I just stepped back, holding the door open for him. He walked into my hallway, and the house instantly felt right again. It felt like home. He hadn't regretted it. He had come back. He had brought me lunch. It was a small gesture, but it was everything. It was the reassurance I desperately needed. It was a quiet knock on the door, a second, deliberate choice to step inside. We ate in the kitchen, the sandwiches he'd bought tasting like the best food I'd ever had. We talked more. He asked about my family. I asked about his. He told me he had a daughter, grown and married, living in Oregon. He showed me a picture of her on his phone. She had his eyes. Learning these details about him, these small, essential pieces of his life, felt like a privilege. The conversation was a slow, careful act of construction, building a bridge between his world and mine. After lunch, a comfortable silence fell between us. Grant looked around my kitchen, his gaze lingering on the faucet, which had been doing its signature drip, drip, drip for the better part of a year. "That tap is going to drive you crazy," he said, a hint of his professional tone creeping back into his voice. "It already does," I admitted. "I could fix it for you," he offered. "I have my tools in the truck." "You don't have to work," I said quickly. "You're not on the clock." He looked at me, his expression soft. "I know," he said. He paused. "Maybe you could help me. I could show you how it's done." And so, my kitchen became our next project. He spread an old towel on the floor under the sink and began to explain the mechanics of a compression faucet. His voice was calm and patient as he pointed out the packing nut and the seat washer. I handed him wrenches and screwdrivers, my earlier feelings of uselessness replaced by a quiet sense of participation. At one point, we were both crouched under the sink, our shoulders pressed together in the cramped space. He was working to loosen a stubborn connection, his muscles straining. "Can you hold the light steady?" he asked, his voice slightly muffled. I held my phone's flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark underbelly of the sink. Our heads were inches apart. I could see the concentration etched on his face, the faint scar above his eyebrow I'd never noticed before. He finally broke the connection with a grunt of satisfaction. He turned his head to smile at me, and his face was so close. The air grew thick again, charged with that familiar, potent energy. The urge to lean in, to close that small distance and kiss him was almost overwhelming. He must have seen it in my eyes. His smile faded, his gaze dropped to my mouth. He started to lean in. My heart hammered. But then, from somewhere above us, came a loud, metallic clang, followed by the sound of water spraying everywhere. We had both forgotten about the main valve. A jet of cold water shot out from the disconnected pipe, dousing us both instantly. We scrambled out from under the sink, sputtering and laughing. Water was gushing everywhere, flooding the kitchen floor. For a second, I panicked. My beautiful, old hardwood floors. But then I looked at Grant. He was soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, his gray shirt dark and clinging to his chest. And he was laughing. A deep, genuine, booming laugh that filled my kitchen and my heart. Seeing him like that, so completely unguarded and joyful, was intoxicating. I started laughing too. We stood there in my flooding kitchen, two grown men, soaking wet and laughing like idiots. The crisis, the potential for damage, seemed completely irrelevant. All that mattered was this moment of shared, ridiculous chaos. "Well," he said, wiping water from his eyes, "I guess we found another thing that needs fixing." The next few weeks were a blur of quiet domesticity. Grant was just there. Not all the time, but enough. He had his own life, his own work, but he made space for me in it, and I made space for him in mine. He'd come over after a job, smelling of paint thinner or fresh-cut lumber, and we'd cook dinner together in my newly flood-tested kitchen. We didn't talk about what we were. We didn't define it. We just let it be. It was a slow, organic process of two solitary lives braiding themselves together. He taught me how to fix the leaky faucet properly. I taught him how to use Photoshop to restore an old, faded photograph of his wife. He'd brought it over one evening, the paper creased and worn. "I was wondering if you could." He'd started, his voice trailing off, full of a rare vulnerability. As I worked on the image, scanning and digitally repairing the cracks and faded spots, he sat beside me, watching. He told me the story behind the photograph, a trip they'd taken to the coast, just after they were married. He spoke of her with a quiet love that was devoid of pain. It was just a part of him, a room in the house of his heart that was hers forever, and I realized I wasn't jealous anymore. Her memory wasn't a threat to what we were building. It was part of the foundation. He was the man he was because he had loved her, and I was falling in love with that man. The fear was still there, of course, a low hum of anxiety beneath the surface of my newfound happiness. It would spike at odd moments. When he'd leave after spending the night, I'd feel a familiar pang of panic until he texted me a few hours later. When he'd talk about a future project, we should build some bookshelves for this wall. A part of me would flinch, terrified of making plans, of trusting that this was real and lasting. My past was a ghost that haunted the edges of my present. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to realize I was too quiet, too anxious, too much work, that I was just another broken thing he'd eventually get tired of fixing. One Saturday, we drove out of the city, into the hills. He had a small, rustic cabin he'd built with his own hands years ago. It was his sanctuary, he said, the place he went to be quiet. He'd never taken anyone there before. The knowledge sat in my chest, a warm, heavy weight. The cabin was simple, one room, with a pot-bellied stove and a wide porch that looked out over a valley. It smelled of cedar and wood smoke. It smelled like him. We spent the day hiking, not talking much, just enjoying the silence of the woods and the comfort of each other's presence. As evening fell, we built a fire on the porch and sat in two old rocking chairs, watching the sky bleed from orange to purple. "It's beautiful here," I said, my voice quiet in the vastness. "It's my favorite place," he replied. He was looking out at the valley, but I could feel his attention was on me. "I wanted you to see it." He turned to me, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. His expression was serious. "Leo, I need to know, are you in this? For real? Because I am." There it was. The direct question. The confrontation with my own fear. All the unspoken anxieties, the what-ifs, the escape routes I'd been unconsciously mapping in my head, they all fell away. There was only him, his honest blue eyes, his quiet strength, and the simple, terrifying, wonderful choice he was offering me. I could let my fear win. I could tell him I wasn't ready, that it was too much, too soon. I could retreat back to my safe, lonely world. Or I could choose him. I could choose this. I reached out and took his hand. His fingers, calloused and strong, wrapped around mine. "I'm in this," I said, and my voice didn't shake. "I'm terrified, but I'm in this." A look of profound relief washed over his face. He brought my hand to his lips and kissed my knuckles. "Good," he said, "because I'm falling in love with you, Leo." The words hung in the cool night air, as real and solid as the mountain in front of us. He was falling in love with me. And in that moment, I knew with an absolute, unshakable certainty that I was already there. "I'm in love with you, too, Grant," I whispered. It was the easiest, most honest thing I had ever said. We stayed at the cabin that weekend. It felt like stepping out of time. We cooked on the wood stove, drank cheap wine from coffee mugs, and slept in a big bed under a pile of heavy quilts. We made love for the first time, and it was like everything else between us. Unhurried, honest, and deeply intimate. It was a rediscovery of my own body, a mapping of his. It was less about frantic passion and more about a slow, deep knowing. It was the feeling of his rough hands on my skin, the sound of his breathing in the quiet of the night, the weight of his arm draped over me as we fell asleep. It was safety. It was peace. It was everything I never knew I was missing. When we drove back to the city on Sunday evening, the world looked different. Sharper. More vibrant. My house, when we pulled up, didn't look like a mausoleum anymore. It looked like a home. Our home. As we walked up the path, Grant slung his arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. "I was thinking," he said, his voice a low rumble against my ear. "That front door? It could use a new coat of paint. A brighter color, maybe. What do you think?" I looked at the old, familiar oak door. It was solid, dependable, perfectly functional. But he was right. It could be something more. It could be a statement. A welcome. I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. "I think that's a great idea," I said. The next morning, I woke up alone in my bed. For a split second, the old panic flared, cold and sharp. But then I smelled it. The scent of coffee, rich and dark, wafting up from the kitchen. I threw on a t-shirt and went downstairs. Grant was standing at the stove, a mug in his hand, looking out the window into the back garden. He was wearing a pair of my gray sweatpants, which were a little too short on him, and an old t-shirt of his own. He looked completely, utterly at home. He turned when he heard me, and a slow, easy smile spread across his face. It was a smile that held the promise of 1,000 more mornings just like this one. "Morning," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. I made coffee. I walked over to him, wrapped my arms around his waist, and buried my face in his chest. He smelled of sleep and coffee in him. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me tight. We stood there for a long moment, just holding each other as the morning sun streamed into the kitchen. I thought about the man I was just a few weeks ago, trapped in this silent house, convinced I was destined to be alone. It felt like a lifetime ago. I thought about the sound of a toolbox, how it used to be a sound of something broken. Now, it was the sound that had saved me. It was the sound of a quiet, capable man walking into my life and patiently, methodically, fixing everything. He hadn't just fixed my house. He had rebuilt me. He had taken my broken pieces and shown me how they could fit together to make something new, something stronger, something whole. I lifted my head and looked at him, really looked at him, and my heart was so full I thought it might burst. He was my home. Finally, I was home.